Ward Wilson is rapidly emerging as the world's leading authority on nuclear deterrence, which it is said he has, more than anybody else, thus far successfully deconstructed in terms of all of the overriding assumptions concerning nuclear deterrence. Is that true? And if so, what are the implications?
Is it true that I'm the world's leading authority? But the fact is, there's very little evidence about deterrence and whether it really works. Nuclear weapons have only been used twice, and so there's a very small base of data from which to build conclusions. And people say, well, nuclear deterrence has kept us safe for 60 years. And that's certainly true as long as the only thing that creates peace is the threat of nuclear war. If there's anything that could possibly create peace, like amity between nations, or the work of international organizations, or countries being worn out after war, or any number, fear of conventional war, any of those things, if they can also create peace, then you can't prove that we've had peace because of 60 years of nuclear weapons. All you can say is we've had peace for 60 years. And as well as that, sometimes there are just periods of peace during history. If you look back at history, for instance, from 1815 to 1848, there were 33 years of peace in Europe, but that obviously wasn't the result of nuclear weapons. The Egyptians had a period of more than 200 years of peace. So sometimes there's just peace during history. So it doesn't seem to me that we can say why there's been peace. There isn't really then definitive evidence that deterrence works, exists. It's a captivating theory. Are we willing to rest our safety and security on a theory?
Well, there are those who certainly recognized the importance of your work. You are currently working on a project supported by the Norwegian government to develop this in more detail. Whom do you have to convince that deterrence is a myth or a false assumption? Is it the public? Is it the nation states? Is it the scientists? Whom?
I think it's all of those. There's probably the most resistant group is the kind of group of experts, physicists, political scientists, nuclear strategists, and some government officials who have committed their careers to the notion that nuclear deterrence is real, it exists, it works. I think that certainly in the United States they've done polling, and American citizens think that nuclear weapons are relatively bad by quite a large margin, say 70%, but they're not deeply convinced against them. So you need to work with citizens in general, you need to work on experts, and I think you need to work in government with government leaders. And of course, there are also countries around the world where they might be interested in building nuclear weapons, and countries that already have nuclear weapons where you want to bolster the arguments of those who oppose building more, having more.
You've made a very convincing and very, very simple argument in terms of nuclear weapons being a clumsy instrument. You talk about you can't use a hammer to fix a watch. Could you develop that a little further?
Imagine that I gave you... the problem with nuclear weapons is that they are really large. We tend to imagine that that there's a linear relationship between usefulness and the size of an explosion. So that for every step up in the size of an explosion, it gets equally more useful. But in fact, it seems to me that the relationship is more like a bell curve, so that, initially the larger the explosion, you go from a hand grenade to a stick of dynamite and so on, that it increases in usefulness. But at some point, it tops out, and then it begins to decrease. And the larger the explosion is, it's less and less useful. I would guess, and I want to do some research on this, but I would guess that 99% of the targets at which explosives are used in war are building-sized or smaller. This means that the ideal size for an explosion is building-sized. You can always, or smaller. I mean, if you have a few targets that are larger, you can combine a few building-sized. Nuclear weapons, why would you want to use a weapon that's going to destroy a quarter of the city in order to take out one building? The other mistake that we've made is to equate destruction with military effectiveness. There's always destruction in war, and oftentimes the side that loses has more destruction than the side that wins. But that doesn't mean that creating destruction in war necessarily wins the war. Look at the French, the War of 1812. The French invade Russia, enormous destruction in Russia, large French army. Moscow is burned, actually, by the Russians. And despite the fact that France is entirely intact, all the damage has been to Russia, the French lose the war. And the reason is that destruction of cities and killing civilians is largely beside the point. In war, as long as there are soldiers who are motivated to fight, the fighting goes on. So you have to defeat the armies. Nuclear weapons, by and large, don't do that very well. What they do best is to kill civilians in large numbers. In war, civilians, you can't win by killing civilians. No war has ever been won. No leader has ever surrendered and then said afterwards, I surrendered because too many civilians were dying. So if that's the case, then why is it that we think that really, really destructive weapons are also really, really effective weapons?